counts.
I gave you a lawful order. You need to move the ambulance. Now!
I am not stopping treatment. My patient is critical. Get your hands off of me! You are interfering with emergency medical care.
You are under arrest for obstruction.
The call came in at 11:42 a.m. on a bright Tuesday in May. A difficulty breathing dispatch, the kind that could be anything from a panic attack to the last moments of a person's life. For Lekia Smith, an 8-year veteran paramedic with Rochester's Monroe Ambulance, it was just another call. She and her partner, David Chen, had been restocking their rig when the alert blared. Within 60 seconds, they were rolling, lights and sirens carving a path through the midday traffic. Lekia had been a paramedic since she was 24, a calling she'd felt after a high school car accident where a calm, steady EMT had held her hand and kept her from panicking. She had dedicated her life to being that steady hand for others. She was known for her unshakable composure, a quiet competence that had a way of lowering the temperature in even the most chaotic scenes. They arrived at a 2-story apartment building on a narrow residential street. The address was a second-floor unit. As David steered the ambulance, he pulled it as far to the right as he could, but the street was tight, lined with parked cars. The front of the rig partially blocked the driveway of the adjacent house. It wasn't ideal, but in a medical emergency, seconds mattered more than parking etiquette. They had to get to the patient. Lekia was already out of the passenger side door, grabbing the primary medical bag and the cardiac monitor. "I'll get the airway kit, you go," David called, pulling the stretcher from the back. Lekia took the stairs 2 at a time. The door to apartment 2B was open, a young man in his 20s waving them in frantically. "It's my roommate, Sarah. I think it was a bee sting. She's allergic. Her EpiPen didn't work," he stammered, his face pale with fear. Lekia's internal clock started ticking faster. Anaphylaxis, one of the true time-sensitive killers. She entered the living room to find a woman in her late 20s slumped on the couch, gasping for air. Her skin was flushed, her lips were swelling, and a faint, high-pitched wheezing sound, stridor, escaped with every desperate breath. Her airway was closing. They had maybe 3 to 4 minutes. "I'm Lekia, a paramedic. We're here to help you, Sarah," she said, her voice calm and authoritative, cutting through the panic in the room. She dropped to her knees, immediately applying a non-rebreather mask and cranking the oxygen. Her fingers found a weak, thready pulse. "David, push another dose of Epi, intramuscular, now, and get a line started. We need fluids and solumedrol." Her hands moved with practiced efficiency. She was assessing vitals, listening to lung sounds, all while giving clear, concise orders. This was her world, a controlled, methodical assault against death. The patient's breathing was becoming more labored, her eyes wide with terror as she struggled to draw a breath. She was losing the fight. They had just administered the second epinephrine injection when a new figure appeared in the doorway, a police officer. He was young, probably not yet 30, with a crisp uniform and a ramrod-straight posture that radiated authority. His name tag read, M. Thorne. His eyes swept the room, not with the look of someone assessing a medical emergency, but of someone surveying a scene for infractions. His gaze landed not on the dying woman on the couch, but on the frantic roommate. Then he turned to Lekia. "Whose ambulance is that outside?" he asked, his tone clipped. Lekia didn't look up. Her entire focus was on trying to establish an IV on the patient, whose veins were collapsing. "It's ours. We have a critical patient here, officer," she replied, her attention fixed on her work. "Well, you're blocking a driveway. The homeowner just called it in. You need to move it. Now!" The command was sharp, impatient. It was an order, not a request. Lekia paused for a fraction of a second, the absurdity of the demand hanging in the air. Here was a woman whose throat was swelling shut, who was seconds away from respiratory arrest, and this officer was worried about a parking complaint. "Officer, this patient is in anaphylactic shock. She can't breathe. We are in the middle of life-saving treatment. We will move the ambulance as soon as we have her stabilized and ready for transport," she said, her voice still even but with a firm, non-negotiable edge. "Patient care takes priority. We can't stop treatment." Officer Thorne took a step into the room. His shadow fell across Likia and her patient. "I didn't ask about your treatment. I gave you a lawful order. Move the ambulance," he repeated, his voice lower, more menacing. David, who had just managed to secure the IV line, looked up, his eyes wide with disbelief. The roommate was frozen, his phone now in his hand, though he wasn't yet recording. Something shifted in the room. The focus was no longer on the medical crisis. It had become a standoff. Likia knew in that instant she had a choice. She could abandon her patient at the most critical moment to move a vehicle a few feet, or she could stand her ground and do the job she had sworn an oath to do. It wasn't a choice at all. "We are not stopping treatment," she said, turning her full attention back to the patient. "David, let's get her on the stretcher. We need to go." It was a decision that would save her patient's life, and in the process, shatter her own. The air in the room grew thick with tension. Officer Thorne's face, which had been a mask of professional arrogance, now flushed with anger. His authority had been questioned, his direct order publicly refused by a paramedic he saw as an obstacle, not a fellow first responder. He had dealt with non-compliance before, usually from belligerent drunks or scared teenagers. He had a simple, effective tool for it: escalation. He believed his badge gave him ultimate authority on any scene, a belief that had been reinforced by years on the force with little oversight or correction. He saw Lekia's focus on her patient not as professional duty, but as insubordination. "I said move it," he growled, stepping forward and placing a hand on Lekia's shoulder. "Now." The touch was not a tap. It was a grip. Lekia flinched, not just from the contact, but from the sheer audacity of it. To be physically interfered with while actively treating a crashing patient was a line she had never seen crossed. "Get your hands off me, officer. You are interfering with emergency medical care," she stated, her voice sharp with a sudden cold fury. "David, let's move. We have to get her out of here." She and David ignored Thorne, moving in practiced sync to position the stretcher next to the couch. They were about to perform a log roll to transfer the patient when Thorne made his move. He grabbed Lekia's arm, this time with force, and yanked her backward. The move was so sudden and violent that she stumbled away from the patient, her medical bag clattering to the floor, its contents spilling across the worn linoleum. The patient, Sarah, let out a choked gasp, her eyes wide with fear as she watched the person trying to save her being assaulted. "You are under arrest for obstruction," Thorne declared, his voice booming in the small apartment. He pulled her arm behind her back with a painful twist. Lekia cried out, a sound of shock and pain. "What are you doing? My patient is dying!" she yelled, struggling against his grip, not to escape, but to get back to Sarah. David was frozen for a second, his mind unable to process the scene. His partner was being arrested in the middle of a critical call. The patient was deteriorating. The roommate, who had finally started recording on his phone, was shouting, "Hey, what the hell? She's helping her! Stop!" The metallic click of the handcuffs locking around Lekia's wrists was the loudest sound she had ever heard. The cold steel bit into her skin. It was surreal. She was in her uniform, the symbol of her role as a healer, being treated like a criminal. Through the haze of disbelief, her paramedic instincts remained. "David, bag her!" she screamed, seeing that Sarah's breathing had become terrifyingly shallow. "Start bagging her now! Don't wait!" Her order galvanized David into action. He grabbed the bag valve mask and positioned it over Sarah's face, forcing air into her oxygen-starved lungs. Thorne was unmoved by the medical drama unfolding just feet away. He had made his decision and was now committed to it. He pulled Lekia toward the door. "You should have complied," he said, his voice a low hiss near her ear. "This is on you." She looked back desperately, her heart pounding with a terror that had nothing to do with her own situation. She saw David, his face a mask of panicked concentration, squeezing the bag, fighting to keep Sarah alive by himself. She saw the roommate, his phone held up, capturing the entire nightmare. This wasn't just an arrest, it was an abandonment of a patient, forced upon her by a man with a badge and a fragile ego. As Thorne marched her down the stairs, she could hear the labored rhythm of David bagging the patient above. Every squeeze was a breath Sarah wouldn't have had otherwise. Every second Thorne kept her away was a second that could lead to irreversible brain damage, or worse. The bright May sunlight hit her as she exited the building, a cruel contrast to the darkness of the situation. He pushed her toward the back of his patrol car. The door slammed shut, the sound echoing the finality of the handcuffs. She was a paramedic, a lifesaver, and she was now locked in the back of a police car, a prisoner, while her patient fought for her life just a few dozen feet away. The sense of helplessness was suffocating, a poison more potent than any she had ever administered. She could only watch and pray that David could do the work of two people long enough to matter. The inside of the patrol car was hot and smelled of stale plastic and disinfectant. Lekia sat on the hard bench, the metal partition a cage wall between her and Officer Thorne. Her wrists ached from the handcuffs, which felt unnecessarily tight. Through the rear window, she watched the scene she'd been torn from. She saw David, now joined by the fire department engine crew that had just arrived, frantically working on Sarah on the stretcher. The firefighters, seeing the situation, immediately took over compressions and bagging, freeing David to administer more drugs. They were a well-oiled machine, but they were minutes behind. Minutes that Thorne had stolen. Lekia saw them load Sarah into the ambulance. David slammed the back doors and jumped into the driver's seat, peeling away from the curb with the sirens screaming. He didn't even glance toward the patrol car. He couldn't afford to. Thorne got into the driver's seat, his movements stiff and deliberate. He didn't look at her. He spent a few moments speaking into his radio, his voice a low, self-assured monotone as he reported the arrest. He used words like uncooperative, obstructing, and refused a lawful order. He was building his narrative, creating a version of events where he was the calm professional and she was the out-of-control public servant. The drive to the precinct was short, only 10 minutes, but it felt like an eternity. The silence was broken only by the crackle of the radio. Lekia's mind raced, replaying the events, searching for something she could have done differently. But every path led back to the same unalterable fact. She had a dying patient, and she had refused to abandon her. There was no other choice to make. At the station, Thorne led her through a side door into the main booking area. The sudden exposure to the mundane world of desks, computers, and fluorescent lights was jarring. Officers looked up as she was walked in, their faces a mixture of curiosity and confusion. A woman in a paramedic's uniform in handcuffs was not a common sight. One of the officers, a heavy-set, gray-haired sergeant behind the booking desk, looked up over his reading glasses. His name was Miller, and he'd been on the job for 30 years. He'd seen everything, and his eyes narrowed instantly. "Thorne, what is this?" Miller asked, his voice a low rumble of weary authority. "I got a paramedic here in cuffs." "Arrested her for obstruction, Sarge," Thorne replied, his voice a little too loud, a little too defensive. He pushed Lekia gently toward the booking counter. "She was interfering with a scene." Miller's gaze shifted from Thorne to Lekia. He saw her uniform, the exhaustion and disbelief in her eyes, and the red marks already forming on her wrists. He looked back at Thorne, a rookie he already knew had a reputation for being hot-headed. "Interfering how? Was she contaminating a crime scene?" "No, she was on a medical call. Her ambulance was blocking a driveway. I ordered her to move it and she refused." A dead silence fell over the booking area. The other officers who had been listening suddenly found their paperwork intensely interesting. Miller slowly took off his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. He had seen young officers make stupid mistakes, but this was a category of its own. "Let me get this straight," Miller said, his voice dangerously quiet. "You arrested a paramedic during a medical call because of where the ambulance was parked." Thorne's confidence began to waver. "She refused a lawful order, Sergeant." "And what was her patient's condition?" Miller pressed. Thorne hesitated. "It was some kind of allergic reaction. Was the patient critical? Thorne didn't answer. He just stood there, his jaw tight. Miller's expression was stone. He turned to another officer. Get her out of those cuffs. Get her a bottle of water. Put her in interview room 2, not a holding cell. He then fixed his gaze on Thorne. You, my office, now, and bring your damn report. The handcuffs were removed and the relief was instant, though the humiliation lingered. Lekia was led to a small, sterile room with a table and 2 chairs. It was better than a cell, but it was still a cage. She sat down, the adrenaline finally beginning to fade, replaced by a deep, bone-rattling exhaustion. The door closed, and she was alone. She could hear the faint, muffled sound of Miller's voice from his office, rising in volume. She couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. It was the sound of a man who had seen a colossal screw-up and was now faced with the ugly job of cleaning it up. 20 minutes later, the door opened. It was Miller. "Ms. Smith," he said, his voice softer now. "Your union's been called. Your partner, David, called your supervisor the second they got to the hospital. A lawyer is on his way. I'm sorry about this." It was the first hint of sanity she'd encountered since Thorne had appeared in that apartment doorway. It wasn't freedom, but it was a start. An hour crawled by in the sterile quiet of the interview room. For Lekia, it was an agonizing eternity filled with the looping replay of the arrest and, worse, the face of her patient, Sarah, struggling for air. Every tick of the clock on the wall felt like a second stolen from Sarah's life. She felt a profound sense of failure, not because of her actions, but because the system that was supposed to work in concert had fractured so violently, with her patient caught in the chasm. She was a healer, trained to mend and sustain, yet she had been rendered powerless, locked away while the consequences of that powerlessness unfolded in an emergency room across town. The door finally opened to reveal Sergeant Miller and a man in a rumpled but expensive-looking suit. He was in his 50s, with a weary but sharp intelligence in his eyes and a briefcase that looked like it had seen its share of battles. "Lekia Smith, I'm Frank Peterson. Your union sent me," he said, extending a hand. His handshake was firm, confident. He radiated an aura of no-nonsense competence that was instantly reassuring. "Sergeant Miller has been cooperative. The charges are baseless. We'll have them dropped, but first, I need you to tell me everything. Don't leave out a single detail." As Lekia recounted the story, the dispatch, the patient's critical condition, Officer Thorne's arrival, his absurd demand, her refusal, the violent arrest, Peterson listened intently, making precise notes on a legal pad. He didn't interrupt, his expression hardening with each detail she provided. When she described Thorne physically pulling her away from Sarah, Peterson's pen stopped moving. He looked up, his eyes cold. "He put his hands on you while you were actively providing patient care?" "Yes. He yanked me away from her." "Were there witnesses?" "Her roommate. He was recording on his phone, and my partner, David." Peterson made a sharp, decisive note. "Good. That's very good." He asked a series of pointed questions. "Did Thorne read you your rights?" "No." "Did he ask about the patient's condition before making his demand?" "No." "Did you at any point physically resist him?" "No, I was trying to get back to my patient." "This is an open and shut case of unlawful arrest and gross interference with emergency medical services," Peterson concluded, closing his notepad. "Thorne let his ego write a check his badge can't cash. The department knows they have a massive problem. They're trying to figure out how to handle it right now." Just then, his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, and his professional demeanor faltered for a second, replaced by a grimace. He answered, his voice low. "Peterson. Yeah, I see. How bad is it?" "Understood." He hung up, his face grim. He looked at Lekia, and she knew instantly the news was not good. Her heart sank. "That was your supervisor," Peterson said, his voice gentle. "He just got off the phone with the attending physician at the hospital." Lekia braced herself. "Is she—" "She's alive," Peterson said quickly. Lekia let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. But, he continued, and the word hung in the air like a death sentence, she's not okay. The delay was critical. She went into full respiratory arrest just as the fire crew arrived. They had to perform a cricothyrotomy in the field, cut a hole in her throat to get an airway. She was without adequate oxygen for an estimated 4 to 5 minutes. Lekia felt the blood drain from her face. 4 to 5 minutes. In the world of emergency medicine, that was an eternity. It was the window where the brain, starved of oxygen, begins to die. "Brain damage," she whispered, the words tasting like ash. Peterson nodded slowly. "A severe hypoxic brain injury. The doctors say it's significant. She's in a medically induced coma in the ICU. They don't know what the long-term prognosis will be, but it's not good." The attending physician was very clear. The delay in definitive care caused by the interference directly contributed to this outcome. The news hit Lekia like a physical blow. The fight was no longer about a wrongful arrest or a bruised ego. It was about a young woman whose life had been irrevocably altered, whose future had been dimmed because a police officer couldn't tolerate being told to wait. Her anger, fear, and frustration coalesced into a cold, hard resolve. This was no longer just about clearing her name. It was about getting justice for Sarah. Peterson saw the change in her eyes. They just escalated this from a simple civil rights violation to a multi-million-dollar federal lawsuit, he said, his voice regaining its steely edge. They have no idea the storm that's about to break over them. 20 minutes later, Lekia walked out of the police station. The charges were being dropped. But as she stepped into the afternoon sun, she wasn't thinking about her freedom. She was thinking about the fight that was just beginning. In the 2 weeks following the incident, a fragile sense of normalcy returned, but it was a poor imitation of Lekia's former life. She was placed on administrative leave, a standard procedure that felt more like a punishment. The quiet hours at home were a torment, her mind endlessly replaying the scene in the apartment, the sound of Sarah's wheezing, the click of the handcuffs. She was in constant contact with her supervisor, desperate for updates from the hospital. The news remained grim. Sarah had been weaned from the coma, but, as predicted, had suffered significant cognitive and motor deficits. She was facing a lifetime of rehabilitation and dependent care. The life of a vibrant young woman had been permanently scarred. Frank Peterson, the union attorney, moved with the swift, calculated precision of a seasoned predator. He filed a federal civil rights lawsuit on Lekia's behalf against Officer Marcus Thorne and the city of Rochester. The complaint was a dry, methodical document, but its clinical language detailed a horrifying sequence of events: violation of Fourth Amendment rights against unlawful seizure, deprivation of liberty, and, most damningly, a state-level charge of intentional interference with emergency medical services resulting in bodily harm. The lawsuit didn't just seek damages for Lekia, it sought to hold the entire system accountable. The city's response was predictable. Their legal department, operating with the reflexive arrogance of an institution unused to being seriously challenged, viewed the lawsuit as a nuisance. They knew the optics were bad, but they trusted in their ability to control the narrative, to bury the case in legal maneuvering and wear Lekia down. Their first move came within a week of the filing. They called Peterson with a settlement offer. $25,000, Peterson told Lekia over the phone, his voice dripping with disdain. They want you to sign a non-disclosure agreement and walk away. They called it a good faith gesture to avoid the costs of litigation. Lekia felt a surge of white-hot anger. $25,000. It was an insult. It was blood money, a pathetic attempt to put a price on her humiliation, on her professional integrity, and most of all, on the life that had been shattered because of Thorne's actions. "No," she said, her voice quiet but unwavering. "Absolutely not." Peterson's sigh was one of relief. "That's what I was hoping you'd say. I already told them respectfully to go to hell. This isn't about money, and they need to understand that. We're going to discovery. We are going to make them turn over every piece of evidence. Thorne's body camera footage, the dispatch logs, his personnel file, everything." The city's lawyers fought back, filing motions to dismiss, arguing that Thorne was protected by qualified immunity, the legal doctrine that shields government officials from liability. They claimed his order to move the ambulance was lawful and that Lekia's refusal constituted obstruction. They painted her as an uncooperative public employee and Thorne as an officer simply trying to maintain order. It was a standard playbook, but Peterson was ready for it. "They're building a fantasy," he told Lekia during a strategy meeting. "Our job is to demolish it with facts. The truth is on our side. The law is on our side, and we have witnesses." The most powerful witness, besides Lekia and David, was Sarah's roommate, Michael. The video he had recorded on his phone was shaky and chaotic, but it was damning. It captured the moment Thorne grabbed Lekia. It captured her cry of protest. It captured David's panicked efforts to keep Sarah breathing. Peterson's legal team had it enhanced by a forensic video analyst, clarifying the audio and stabilizing the image. It was a gut-wrenching piece of evidence. The city, however, remained confident, largely because they believed Thorne's official report and his body camera footage would support their version of events. They assumed the footage would show a belligerent paramedic refusing a reasonable request from a calm officer. They had made a fatal miscalculation. They had not yet understood that the truth of the matter wasn't a question of politeness or tone. It was a question of a paramedic's non-negotiable duty to her patient. And they had grossly underestimated Lekia Smith. They saw a paramedic, a city employee they thought they could intimidate. They didn't see a fighter who had decided that this battle was not just for herself, but for every first responder who had ever been bullied, obstructed, or disrespected by an officer who put ego before a human life. She would not back down. She would not be silenced. She would see this through to the end. The discovery phase of the lawsuit was a slow, grinding war of attrition. For 4 months, Frank Peterson's office filed motions, subpoenas, and requests for documents, while the city's attorneys responded with objections, delays, and heavily redacted files. They were trying to bleed Peterson dry, to make the process so expensive and exhausting that Lekia would be forced to relent. But Peterson had the backing of a national union, and his resolve was absolute. He was a bulldog latched onto a throat, and he would not let go. The centerpiece of their fight, the item the city resisted turning over the most, was Officer Thorne's body camera footage. When they finally produced it under a court order, Peterson and Lekia watched it together in a small conference room. The video began with Thorne's perspective as he walked up the stairs to the apartment. The audio was crystal clear. It captured the frantic roommate, and then it captured Lekia, her voice calm and focused as she gave medical commands to David. It captured the high-pitched stridor of Sarah struggling to breathe, the unmistakable sound of a medical emergency. Then came Thorne's voice, devoid of concern, asking about the ambulance. The camera became an impartial, unblinking witness to the entire confrontation. It recorded Lekia's professional explanation. "Officer, this patient is in anaphylactic shock. She can't breathe. We are in the middle of life-saving treatment." It recorded Thorne's dismissive, escalating demands. It recorded him saying, "I didn't ask about your treatment. I gave you a lawful order." Most damningly, it recorded the moment he reached out and grabbed her. The camera jolted as he pulled her away from the patient. Lekia's cry of, "You are interfering with emergency medical care," was perfectly audible. The footage completely corroborated Lekia's account and eviscerated the narrative Thorne had constructed in his official report, where he claimed she had been agitated and uncooperative, and that he had gently guided her away to de-escalate the situation. The video showed a professional doing her job and a bully abusing his power. The next step was the depositions. Lekia's was first. For 6 hours, the city's lawyers questioned her, trying to poke holes in her story, trying to paint her as an anti-police hothead. She remained calm, professional, and consistent, answering every question with the same direct, factual clarity she used on a medical call. She was unshakable. Then, it was Officer Thorne's turn. He walked into the deposition room flanked by a police union lawyer, his expression a mixture of confidence and defiance. He clearly believed his uniform and the backing of his department made him untouchable. Peterson began calmly, asking Thorne to walk him through his training on interacting with other first responders. Thorne's answers were textbook perfect. Then Peterson moved to the incident itself. Officer Thorne, in your report, you stated that the paramedic, Ms. Smith, was agitated. What did you observe that led you to that conclusion? Her tone was uncooperative. She refused to listen to me. Let's review a portion of your body camera footage, Peterson said, cueing the video on a large monitor. He played the clip of Lekia's calm, firm explanation. Does that sound agitated to you, officer? The union lawyer objected, but the point was made. Peterson continued relentlessly. Did you have any medical training that would allow you to override a paramedic's assessment of a patient's condition? No, but did you hear the patient wheezing, the sound medical professionals identify as stridor, a sign of a closing airway? Thorne was silent. You stated in your report you gently guided Ms. Smith away from the patient. Is that what we are seeing on this screen? Peterson played the clip of Thorne yanking Lekia backward. The room was silent. Thorne's face was pale. The confident officer who had walked in was gone, replaced by a man squirming under the weight of his own recorded actions. The deposition transcript, combined with the video, was a legal kill shot. The city's case was not just weak, it was non-existent, and Frank Peterson was about to make them pay for it. The day after Officer Thorne's disastrous deposition, Frank Peterson received a call from the city's lead attorney. The tone had changed. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a strained, pragmatic weariness. They wanted to talk settlement again. The new offer was $300,000. It was a significant jump, a clear signal that they knew the body camera footage had crippled their defense. When Peterson relayed the offer to Lekia, her response was the same. No. It wasn't about the number. A quiet settlement would allow the city to bury the incident. It would allow the police department to avoid any real, meaningful change. Thorne might get a slap on the wrist, but the culture that enabled him would remain untouched. This has to be public, Lekia told Peterson. It has to mean something. We're not stopping. Peterson, respecting her wishes, pushed the case toward mediation, a final step before a full-blown jury trial. The process involved a neutral third party, in this case a retired federal judge named Arthur Vance, who would review the evidence from both sides and attempt to broker a resolution. Judge Vance was a stern, intelligent man with a reputation for cutting through legal posturing and getting to the heart of a matter. The city's legal team arrived at the mediation with spreadsheets and risk assessment reports, prepared to argue about liability percentages and insurance payouts. They were still treating the situation as a numbers game. Peterson arrived with a single laptop. When it was his turn to present, he didn't make a long, impassioned speech. He simply turned the monitor toward Judge Vance. Your Honor, he said, before we discuss any legal theory, I'd like you to see what happened on May 12th. He played the body camera footage. He played Michael's cell phone video. Then he presented the hospital records, highlighting the emergency cricothyrotomy and the official diagnosis, severe hypoxic brain injury. He concluded with a sworn affidavit from Sarah's attending neurologist, a single, devastating sentence of which read, "It is my professional opinion, to a reasonable degree of medical certainty, that the 4 to 5 minute delay in transport and advanced airway management directly and proximately caused the irreversible brain damage suffered by the patient." Judge Vance watched everything without expression. When the presentation was over, he sat in silence for a full minute. Then he looked at the team of city lawyers. Is this everything? He asked, his voice low. Is there any evidence you possess that contradicts what I've just seen? The lead attorney started to stammer about context, about the officer's perspective, about the stress of the job. Judge Vance held up a hand, silencing him. That's a no, he said flatly. He declared a 30-minute recess. When they reconvened, the judge's demeanor had shifted from neutral arbiter to blunt realist. He addressed the city's attorneys directly. "I'm going to be very clear with you," he began. "If this case goes to trial, you will lose. You will not just lose, you will be annihilated. A jury of 12 citizens is going to see a police officer pull a paramedic away from a dying woman because he was upset about where she parked her ambulance. They are going to hear a doctor testify that this officer's actions caused a young woman to suffer permanent brain damage. The number they write on that verdict form will have a comma and a lot of zeros. It will be a headline on the national news for a week." He leaned forward. "Your officer's conduct was indefensible. Your legal position is untenable. Your liability is catastrophic." He turned to Peterson. "What do you want?" Peterson didn't hesitate. He laid out their terms: a substantial monetary settlement for Lekia and a separate, even larger trust fund established for Sarah's lifelong medical care. But that wasn't all. "We want policy changes," Peterson said. "Mandatory department-wide training on interacting with EMS personnel. A new protocol that explicitly states that in a medical emergency, the authority of the on-scene paramedic regarding patient care is absolute. Any officer who interferes with EMS will face an automatic internal affairs investigation and potential termination. These terms are non-negotiable." The city lawyers looked at each other, then at the judge's stony face. They knew they were beaten. The final settlement was for $1.2 million for Lekia and a $5 million trust for Sarah. More importantly, the city agreed to implement every single policy change Peterson had demanded. It was a total surrender, a victory not just for Lekia, but for every first responder who would ever have to work a scene in the city of Rochester again. The settlement was finalized on a cold morning in late November, 6 months after Lekia's life had been turned upside down. The news of the massive payout and, more significantly, the sweeping policy reforms sent shockwaves through the city's emergency services community. It was a vindication that resonated deeply with paramedics, EMTs, and firefighters who had long endured a quiet culture of disrespect from a minority of police officers who saw them as subordinates rather than partners. For Officer Marcus Thorne, the settlement was the final nail in the coffin of his career. The internal affairs investigation, armed with the body camera footage and the deposition transcript, concluded he had violated multiple department policies, including abuse of authority, conduct unbecoming an officer, and dereliction of duty. He was terminated from the Rochester Police Department 1 week after the settlement was announced. Lekia used a portion of her settlement to co-found a non-profit organization dedicated to providing legal and psychological support for first responders involved in critical incidents, particularly those involving interagency conflict. She knew firsthand the toll such an event could take, the feeling of isolation, and the fear that your career could be destroyed for simply doing your job correctly. Her goal was to ensure no one else had to face that alone. But the most significant change was yet to come. The high-profile nature of the case had caught the attention of a state assemblywoman whose own father was a retired firefighter. Horrified by the body camera footage, which had been leaked to the press, she drafted new legislation. The bill, officially titled the Emergency Personnel Protection Act, made it a felony in the state of New York for any person, including a law enforcement officer, to intentionally interfere with a first responder who is actively providing emergency medical care. It legally codified the principle that Lekia had fought for. Patient care takes precedence. The bill became colloquially known as Lekia's Law. Both Lekia and Sarah's family were invited to testify at the state capitol. Lekia, in her dress uniform, spoke with quiet, powerful conviction about her duty as a paramedic. But it was Sarah's father who moved the chamber to stunned silence. He described his vibrant, independent daughter, and then he described the woman she was now, a person who struggled with memory, with simple tasks, who would never live independently again. "My daughter is alive because of Lekia Smith," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But the life she knew is gone. It was taken from her in a matter of minutes, not by a disease or an accident, but by a choice. a choice made by an officer who valued his authority more than my daughter's breath. I ask you to pass this law so that no other family has to stand here and tell a story like mine." The bill passed with unanimous bipartisan support. Lekia returned to her job at Monroe Ambulance 2 months after the settlement. Her first day back was quiet. But as she walked into the station, the crews on shift stopped what they were doing. They stood up, and they began to applaud. It was a quiet, solemn ovation, a gesture of profound respect and gratitude. She was one of them, and she had fought a battle they all feared, and she had won it for all of them. Working scenes with the Rochester PD was different now. The tension was gone, replaced by a new level of professional respect. Officers on scene deferred to her medical judgment without question. The new protocols were being taught at the academy, her case study and body camera footage becoming a mandatory part of the curriculum for all new recruits, a powerful lesson in what not to do. The legacy of that terrible May afternoon was not one of trauma, but of transformation. A young woman's life was irrevocably damaged, a tragedy that could never be undone. But from that injustice, a new shield of protection was forged, a legal precedent that would safeguard countless first responders and the patients they served for generations to come. Lekia Smith never sought to be a hero, but by simply steadfastly refusing to abandon her duty, she became something more. She became a catalyst for change, proving that the courage of one person could indeed bend the arc of the system toward justice. At its core, the tragedy that befell Sarah and the ordeal that Lekia endured were born from a deeply human and deeply flawed psychological driver: fragile ego. Officer Thorne's actions were not rooted in a desire to uphold the law, but in a desperate need to assert dominance when his authority was perceived as being challenged. For some individuals, the badge and uniform are not tools to serve the public, but armor for a fragile sense of self-worth. In that apartment, Thorne was not a peacekeeper. He was a young man, likely insecure, who encountered a woman, Lekia, who possessed an unshakable authority born not from a badge, but from competence and purpose. Her calm, professional refusal to comply with his irrational demand was not seen as a paramedic performing her duty, but as a personal affront that threatened his entire identity as an authority figure. His catastrophic decision to arrest her was a desperate, punitive act to reclaim a sense of control he felt slipping away. If Lekia had been equipped with her own body camera, would it have deterred Thorne? Perhaps. The knowledge of being recorded from a second, impartial angle can sometimes temper the worst impulses. If she had immediately requested a police supervisor the moment the conflict began, could the entire incident have been de-escalated? It's possible a more experienced sergeant would have recognized the absurdity of the situation and reined in their rookie officer. These what-ifs highlight a crucial lesson. In a world of overlapping authorities, documentation and immediate escalation to a higher command can be vital self-protection tools for first responders. The system failed that day, but there are ways to build in checks and balances to protect those on the front lines. The ultimate moral of this story is that true authority is not granted by a uniform or a title. It is earned through sound judgment, competence, and a commitment to a higher duty. Lekia's authority came from her oath to her patient. Thorne's was an illusion he tried to enforce with handcuffs. In any conflict between procedure and a human life, the life must always win. Our systems and laws must be designed to protect the individuals who are brave enough to make that choice, every single time. It is a reminder that the most heroic acts are often not grand gestures, but quiet, steadfast refusals to do the wrong thing, no matter the personal cost. What are your thoughts on how to better protect first responders in these situations? Have you ever witnessed a conflict between different emergency services? Share your stories and ideas in the comments below. Your support helps us continue to bring these important stories to light. The West remembers.